A millionaire man sees a waitress giving his disabled son his own lunch. What he did afterwards is unbelievable. Inside a small cafe on the corner of a busy avenue, Andrea Castillo mechanically wiped down the worn wooden counter. Her uniform was damp from the steam of the coffee machine, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the scent of warm bread still lingering in the air, even though the few customers had already left. She sighed, feeling the weight of exhaustion. The overdue bills tormented her mind like a ticking time bomb. Rent was due, the electricity bill threatened to be cut off, and her salary barely covered the cost of food. It wasn't the first time she found herself in this situation, but it seemed like every month was harder than the last. "Andrea, we're closing," announced Javier, her co-worker, as he turned off one of the lights in the cafe. She nodded, finishing up the last of the dishes. Looking through the glass, she saw the storm intensify. The wind howled, shaking the trees and sweeping wet leaves along the sidewalk. "I'm going to take out the trash. I'll be right back," she said. Grabbing the large black bag, she pushed open the back door. The biting cold hit her face, making her shiver. The alley was dark, lit only by the faint light from a distant street lamp. The sound of the rain echoed on the tin rooftops, and water flowed down the drains like small rivers with no destination. It was then that she noticed something unusual. In the midst of the storm, just a few feet away, there was a small, motionless silhouette. Andrea blinked, trying to make out the figure through the curtain of rain. Under the dim light of the street lamp, she could just make out a blond boy, fragile-looking, sitting in a wheelchair. His clothes were soaked, and his hair clung to his pale forehead. He was visibly shivering, hugging his arms in a futile attempt to warm himself. Andrea's heart tightened. What was a child doing here, alone, in this bitter cold? She dropped the trash bag and hurried over, kneeling in front of him. "Hey, sweetheart, what are you doing here? Where are your parents?" she asked gently. The boy looked up at her, his large eyes filled with fear. He seemed lost, as if he didn't know how to answer. His lips were purple, and he murmured almost inaudibly, I don't know." Andrea felt a lump form in her throat. The little one was clearly terrified. The wind continued to blow fiercely, and water dripped from the wheels of his chair, falling onto the dirty ground of the alley. Without hesitation, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Let's get out of this rain, okay? I'll take care of you." With tenderness, Andrea maneuvered the wheelchair into the cafe, feeling the boy's resistance at first, but he soon relaxed. As they entered, Javier turned in surprise. "What? Who's this boy?" "I found him outside. He was alone, freezing. I don't know where his parents are," Andrea explained, grabbing a blanket from the staff closet. Javier furrowed his brow but didn't ask any more questions. He simply grabbed a towel and handed it to her. Andrea kneeled in front of the boy and draped the blanket over his shoulders. He trembled at the feel of the warm, soft fabric and pulled it closer to his body. "You're safe now," she said with a gentle smile. She went to the kitchen to prepare hot chocolate. While waiting for the milk to heat up, she glanced at the boy. He remained silent, observing everything warily. She placed the cup on the table and gently pushed it toward him. "Here, this will warm you up." The boy hesitated for a moment, then took the cup with trembling hands. He took a small sip, and for the first time, his eyes reflected something beyond fear. He held the cup cautiously, as if afraid the sudden warmth might harm him, or maybe because he wasn't used to receiving something so simple, yet so valuable. His large, shy eyes wavered between the drink and the table before him. His silence was almost tangible, a reflection of the fear and uncertainty he carried in his drenched body. Wrapped in the blanket Andrea had given him, he looked smaller, almost disappearing into the heavy, warm fabric. Andrea watched him without rushing. She had dealt with frightened children before. She knew that when someone was cornered, forcing a conversation or pressuring them would only make them retreat further. So she let him settle at his own pace. She just picked up a dry cloth and discreetly wiped the table, as if she wasn't paying much attention to him. Her stomach grumbled lightly, reminding her that she hadn't had dinner yet. On the counter, the sandwich she had saved for the end of her shift remained wrapped in parchment paper. It was her only meal until the next morning, but as she looked at the boy, so small and fragile before her, hunger seemed to lose its importance. Without thinking, she picked up the sandwich and unwrapped it slowly. With a sharp knife, she cut the bread in half, the movements precise and natural, without any intention of dramatizing the gesture. When she finished, she pushed one half toward him, gently placing it on the table. The boy looked up, surprised. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He looked at Andrea, then at the sandwich, as if trying to understand why someone would do such a thing. Andrea smiled, a small, unexaggerated smile, without haste. "You can eat. It's fresh," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if that kindness cost her nothing, as if he had as much right to that food as she did. The boy hesitated. His hands, still holding the cup, didn't move immediately. Maybe he was waiting for her to change her mind, for her to take the plate back, for there to be some hidden condition behind the offer. When he realized that Andrea wasn't going to retract her words, he let out a small sigh. Slowly, he placed the cup on the table and reached for the sandwich. His fingers touched the bread lightly, as if simply holding it was something new to him. The first bite was small, cautious. The melted cheese stuck to the corner of his mouth, and he used the sleeve of his shirt to wipe it away, not thinking. Andrea continued to watch, but without intruding on his space. She picked up the other half of the sandwich and took a bite, chewing slowly. Her aim was simple, to show him that there was no obligation, no debt, just two people sharing a meal on a cold night. Outside, under the persistent drizzle, Fernando Rios observed the scene from his black car. His face remained impassive, but something inside him stirred uncomfortably. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Behind the tinted windows, Fernando analyzed every detail. The way the woman looked at his son, without any sign of pity or discomfort, was something he rarely saw. People, even those with the best intentions, always looked at Matteo with a mixture of compassion and unease, as if, in some way, they were relieved they weren't in his place. But this waitress, she showed none of that. There was no hesitation, no forced expression, no exaggerated attempt to appear kind. She simply treated him like an ordinary child. Fernando felt his jaw tighten. He had lost count of how many times he had seen people approach Matteo with false kindness. Teachers, therapists, even doctors and nannies. Everyone followed the same predictable pattern. They tried to be friendly, but deep down, they saw his son as someone different, a burden, a problem to be dealt with. That was why he had learned to be cynical, to doubt the intentions of anyone who came too close. But here, on this rainy night, in this modest cafe, a woman with no obligation or personal interest simply saw a boy who was cold and hungry and did what any decent person would do. And then, something really struck him. She took her own sandwich, cut it in half, and gave half to Matteo without a second thought. Fernando felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. His son hesitated, looked at the sandwich, then at the woman, and finally took a bite. Then something even rarer happened. Matteo smiled. It was a small, shy smile, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Fernando pressed his lips together, looking away for a brief moment, as if he needed to regain control of his own thoughts. When he turned his attention back to the scene, a strange discomfort settled in his chest. The woman didn't know who Matteo was. She didn't know he was the son of one of the wealthiest men in the country. Yet she took care of him without hesitation. Inside the cafe, Andrea took a bite of her own sandwich, as if proving that this wasn't a favor, that she wasn't expecting anything in return. Fernando exhaled slowly, feeling that, no matter how small, this moment would stay with him for a long time. From the front seat, his assistant cleared his throat discreetly. "Mr. Rios, are we going to continue staying here?" Fernando didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the woman inside the cafe. Finally, without taking his eyes off her, he gave a firm, controlled order. "Find out who she is." The assistant nodded, already taking out his phone to begin the search. Fernando kept his eyes on the scene for a few more moments before speaking. "Find Mateo." Without saying anything else, he locked his phone screen and took a deep breath, still feeling the weight of what he had just witnessed. A few minutes later, Esteban got out of the car and entered the cafe. His gaze quickly swept across the room until he found Mateo still sitting at the table, wrapped in the blanket. Without wasting time, he approached and said in a firm, controlled voice, "Mateo, let's go. Your father is waiting." The boy lifted his eyes and, without a word, set the cup aside. Andrea observed the scene silently, noticing how Mateo seemed to shut himself off again. Without exchanging another word, Esteban maneuvered the wheelchair out of the cafe. Once they reached the car, he opened the door and carefully helped the boy inside. After securing the seatbelt, Esteban took his place in the front seat and instructed the driver, "We can go." The car glided smoothly down the rain-soaked street, while Fernando, without looking back, remained immersed in his own thoughts. Fernando Rios couldn't sleep that night. Lying in the immense bed of his luxurious room, he stared at the dark ceiling, his mind spinning around the scene he had witnessed in the cafe. The rain that had beaten against the windows for hours had already stopped, leaving behind only a quiet silence that seemed to amplify his thoughts. He wondered why that woman had affected him so much. It wasn't as if it was the first time he had seen a stranger act with kindness. But there was something about the unpretentious way she treated Mateo that unsettled him. No pity, no condescension. The naturalness with which she offered her own food to his son still echoed in his mind. To her, Mateo wasn't a different boy. He was simply a child who was cold and hungry. And that somehow affected him more than he wanted to admit. By dawn, he was already in his office before his employees arrived. The Rios group building, imposing and glass-walled, reflected the golden light of the rising sun. Fernando sat at his dark mahogany desk and opened the file that his assistant had left for him. Andrea Castillo. Her name was printed in bold at the top of the document. Below, a clear photo showed the face he had seen the previous night, the waitress from the cafe. His eyes scanned the information quickly, absorbing every detail. No relevant academic background, no influential contacts, no impressive professional history. Just a young woman who had spent her life working in menial jobs, struggling to survive. He flipped through the pages, analyzing each point. Andrea had moved several times, always holding unstable jobs without significant financial progress. There was nothing about her that indicated any hidden ambition, no suspicious connections, no ties to the elite, just an ordinary woman living a tough life. Fernando leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the desk. "Nothing important, no money," he muttered to himself. Then he pressed his lips together, thoughtful. But the only one who treated Mateo like a normal person. He closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. Something inside him had already made a decision before he even realized it. Later that day, his immaculate black car parked in front of the modest cafe where it had all begun. The luxurious vehicle stood in stark contrast to the simple neighborhood, drawing the attention of a few customers entering and exiting. Inside, Andrea was cleaning one of the tables when she noticed his presence. When she lifted her eyes, she found herself staring at a tall man in an expensive suit who had just entered the cafe. His walk was firm, calculated, like someone used to being noticed. There was a weight to his presence, an authority that didn't need to be spoken. Andrea immediately recognized his face, the same one she had seen reflected in the dark window of the car the night before. She straightened her posture, wiping her hands on her apron, unsure of what to expect. Fernando approached the counter and stopped in front of her. His dark, evaluative eyes gave away little of what he was thinking. Then, in a firm, no-nonsense voice, he said, "We need to talk." Andrea didn't like being looked at like that. Fernando Rios's gaze was firm, evaluative, as if he were trying to decode her. It didn't seem arrogant, but neither did it show any kindness. It was the kind of look that silently analyzed every detail of her, every expression, every flicker of reaction. She wasn't exactly sure why it bothered her so much. Maybe because she was used to being invisible to men like him. Executives in expensive suits, used to moving in circles she would never belong to. Men who made decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of people without even looking them in the eye. But here he was, standing right in front of her, with all his attention focused on her. A discomfort grew in her chest, and without realizing it, she crossed her arms, adopting a defensive posture. "If you're here because of your son, I just wanted to help him," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, but she couldn't quite hide the unease. Fernando didn't react immediately. His dark eyes remained fixed on her, and Andrea couldn't decipher what he was thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, without urgency. "I'm not here to complain." That caught her off guard. Andrea furrowed her brow, still trying to understand the reason for his visit. If he wasn't there to complain, then what did he want? Before she could ask, Fernando slid his hand into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and took out a small business card. With a controlled movement, he placed it on the counter between them. The soft sound of paper touching wood seemed louder than it should have. Andrea lowered her eyes to the card. His name was printed in elegant golden letters. Fernando Rios, Rios Group. Below that, an address in the city's financial district. "Tomorrow at 10 o'clock at the Rios Tower. I want to talk about an opportunity." Andrea blinked a few times. "What?" She alternated her gaze between the card and the man before her, trying to understand if this was some kind of joke. But Fernando Rios didn't seem like someone who played with things like that. "An opportunity?" she repeated, feeling confusion take over her mind. Fernando just held her gaze, impassive. He seemed to be measuring her reaction, waiting for her to process the information. Andrea felt the weight of the small card between her fingers, but she couldn't decide if this was a genuine invitation or a disguised trouble. "I don't understand," she said finally. "You will tomorrow," Fernando replied, without breaking eye contact. Andrea pressed her lips together, suspicious. No details, no explanation, just a time and an address. "If I go?" she asked, testing him. A slight smile appeared at the corner of Fernando's lips, as if he had already expected that question. "That depends on you." He didn't say anything else. He simply held her gaze for a few more seconds before turning to leave. His stride was calm and confident, like someone who had already made his decision and didn't need to justify himself. Andrea stayed where she was, watching him as he crossed the cafe and disappeared through the door. She still held the card tightly, as if it could somehow give her answers that Fernando Rios refused to provide. She felt a knot form in her stomach. What could a man like him possibly want with a simple waitress? Andrea squeezed the card between her fingers, feeling the smooth, firm texture of the golden paper. Fernando Rios's name glimmered faintly under the weak light of the small apartment where she lived, as if it were an invitation to a world that didn't belong to her. She had spent the entire walk home trying to ignore the weight of that offer, but now, sitting at the edge of her bed with tense shoulders, there was no escaping it. Her past used to be a place she refused to visit. There was no nostalgia, no longing, just scars and memories she preferred to keep locked away. But something about that night, that card, had opened doors she had kept closed for so long. She closed her eyes for a moment, and it was as if everything came rushing back at once, overwhelming her. She remembered the first time she understood the meaning of the word loss. She was a little girl, her hair messy from the cold wind, holding her mother's hand as they walked to the hospital. Andrea didn't understand why the adults whispered around her, nor why her mother's gaze seemed filled with goodbye. Days later, a grief-stricken father explained that her mom wouldn't be coming back. From that moment on, everything crumbled. Her father, consumed by grief, stopped being the rock she could lean on. Alcohol became his only companion, and the promises he made to his daughter became empty words. Andrea could still hear him telling her everything would be okay, that they would get through it together, but together didn't last long. One night he left and never came back. The social worker who showed up at their house the next morning spoke in a gentle voice, but her eyes carried that distant pity Andrea would come to recognize throughout her life. She was sent to a shelter and later to the first of many homes that would never truly be hers. Foster homes followed one after another. Families who took her in out of obligation, looks that said she would never truly belong. Some homes were cold and indifferent, but others. At 16, she learned that sometimes danger came disguised as kindness. The last house she lived in was run by a couple who presented themselves to the world as good and generous. The woman was distant, but the husband, he had a gaze that sent shivers down her spine every time he looked at her for too long. Andrea spent months ignoring the signs, pretending that her intuition was wrong, until the night she woke up to footsteps in the hall and the doorknob of her room slowly turning. She didn't wait to find out what would happen. With nothing more than a worn-out coat and a few savings she had managed to keep over the years, she ran away that very night. From that day on, she promised herself she would never depend on anyone again. The years that followed were hard, but she survived. She cleaned offices, worked in stores, served tables in cafes that went through employees like disposable items. She collected looks of disdain, empty offers of help from people who wanted something in return. Life had given her few options but to fight for every penny she earned. And now, a man like Fernando Rios appeared, offering her an opportunity. She chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. She turned the card between her fingers, examining every detail. What could a millionaire like him want with a simple waitress? She had heard too many promises in her life. She had seen doors close after being opened, just enough to give her hope. Looking at the small piece of paper that could change everything, she whispered to herself, "I can't afford to trust so easily." But even as she said that, she knew she would spend the night with the card still tightly held between her fingers. Andrea didn't sleep a wink that night. The small golden card lay on the table beside her bed, and despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her muscles, her mind wouldn't let her rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw herself entering a world that wasn't hers, surrounded by people who would analyze her with critical stares, waiting for her to make a mistake. What if it's a trap? What if Fernando Rios is like so many others who have crossed her path, offering something just to take away everything she still had? But what if it's not? That question haunted her until dawn. When the alarm rang, Andrea jumped out of bed, exhausted but determined. She couldn't spend the rest of her life running from everything that felt too big for her. If that opportunity was a farce, she would turn around and move on. But if it wasn't, then maybe, just maybe, something was about to change. A few hours later, she stood before the Rios Tower. The building was imposing, almost entirely made of mirrored glass, reflecting the cloudy sky over Monterey. Outside, impeccably dressed men and women hurried along, their phones in hand, their expressions determined. Andrea swallowed hard. She felt completely out of place here. She was wearing her best pair of jeans and a simple blouse, which she had chosen specifically so as not to look careless. But when she compared her reflection with the executives in high heels and tailored suits, it felt like she had come from another planet. She took a deep breath before entering the lobby. The interior of the Rios Tower was even more intimidating than she had imagined. The marble floor shone as if no one had ever stepped on it. The massive glass walls let in daylight, giving the space a modern and sophisticated air. Well-dressed receptionists worked behind dark wood counters, while men in suits spoke in low, serious tones. Andrea walked up to the main counter, ignoring the feeling of being watched. The receptionist, a woman with a perfect bun and a cold expression, looked up at her and appraised her from head to toe. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone betraying clear suspicion. Andrea hesitated for a second before sliding the business card across the counter. As soon as the woman read Fernando Rios' name, her expression changed instantly. "One moment, please," she said, her voice now more respectful. She picked up the phone, exchanged a few words, then looked back at Andrea. "Mr. Rios is expecting you." Andrea nodded and followed the directions to the elevators. When the doors opened on the top floor, a secretary guided her toward the businessman's office. She entered. The office was spacious and luxurious, with glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city. Dark wood shelves displayed books and expensive objects, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Behind it sat Fernando Rios, maintaining the same impeccable posture he had the night before. He watched her closely as she took in the room, absorbing every detail. And for the first time, Andrea noticed a faint smile appear at the corner of his lips. "Let's get to the point," he said. Fernando Rios leaned slightly back in his chair, watching her with an intense and calculated gaze. There was something about him that radiated authority, but not in an aggressive way. It was the kind of presence that made anyone pay attention, without him needing to raise his voice or make any effort to impose respect. Andrea held his gaze, not backing down. If she was here, she at least wanted to leave, knowing exactly what he wanted from her. Then he spoke. "I want you to work for me." The words came directly, without beating around the bush, and they hit Andrea like an unexpected punch. She blinked, surprised, trying to absorb what she had just heard. "What?" Fernando maintained his calm expression, as if his proposal was something entirely ordinary. "I want you to work for me," he repeated, not rushing. Andrea furrowed her brow. Her first reaction was to think he was joking, but the way he was looking at her, the firmness in his voice, there was no trace of irony or sarcasm. She crossed her arms. "And what exactly would this work consist of?" she asked, still suspicious, waiting for him to say something absurd, something empty, promising much but demanding a steep price in return. Fernando leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "I need someone who sees the world the way you do." Andrea raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do I see the world, Mr. Rios?" He allowed a small smile to form at the corner of his lips, as if he had already anticipated this question. "Someone who isn't impressed by money." She remained silent for a moment. Those words echoed in her mind. She knew it was true. She had never been impressed by luxury because she had never been part of it. She had always seen the world for what it really was, without filters, without empty promises. People like Fernando Rios were used to being surrounded by flatterers and opportunists, but she had never had time for that kind of game. but it still didn't make sense. "You don't know me," she said, narrowing her eyes. "But I've seen enough," Fernando replied. That statement bothered her. How could someone claim to know her after just seeing one gesture? Just because she had helped a lost boy on a stormy night. She tapped her fingers on her thigh, thinking. "And if I don't want to?" Fernando let out a slight sigh, as if he wasn't surprised by her resistance. "Then you get up, walk out that door, and continue living the same life you were living before yesterday," he said simply. Andrea bit her lip. That was the thing. Her life wasn't bad, but it wasn't exactly good either. Surviving was her routine. There were no prospects, just work and bills to pay. And now a millionaire wanted her on his team. She didn't know exactly what she was getting herself into, but she also had nothing to lose. Taking a deep breath, she felt the weight of the decision. Then, without breaking eye contact, she said, "I'm in." Fernando simply nodded, satisfied. Andrea followed Fernando through the wide, spotless halls of the Rios Tower, feeling the eyes of everyone on her. The quick steps of the executives echoed on the marble floor, accompanied by the low murmur of professional conversations. Everyone there seemed to belong. She, on the other hand, felt like an intruder in unfamiliar territory. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. "Who is she?" one assistant whispered to her colleague, casting a discreet but curious glance at Andrea. "I don't know, but I heard she was brought in by Rios himself." "This is just one of his whims," murmured a grey-haired man in an impeccable suit, adjusting his glasses on his nose. "Some poor thing he decided to rescue from the street. She won't last a week." Andrea pretended not to hear. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, determined not to react. She had been underestimated so many times in her life that it no longer surprised her. Still, she couldn't deny the discomfort that grew inside her. Fernando, walking beside her, noticed her tension. Without interrupting his steps, he spoke in a calm tone, laced with subtle humor. "If it helps, many people here ignore me too." Andrea shot him a sideways glance, surprised by the joke. "Oh, I can only imagine how hard your life must be," she replied, raising an eyebrow with irony. Fernando smiled lightly. "You have no idea." The quick response made Andrea relax for a moment. But the truth was, even with the light tone of their conversation, she knew she had to prove her worth. She wouldn't allow herself to be just another fleeting fancy of a bored millionaire. They entered one of the meeting rooms, where Fernando introduced her to some of his executives. The men and women with serious expressions studied her carefully, as if they were trying to decipher the reason for her presence. Andrea stood firm, meeting their gaze with determination. "Andrea Castillo will be collaborating with us on a special project," Fernando announced, offering no further details. The tension in the room grew slightly. No one dared to question him directly, but Andrea noticed the exchanged glances. Some were of simple curiosity, while others clearly held a measure of distrust. She observed everything closely. The corridors, the glass-walled offices, the hurried conversations between employees who seemed afraid to lose even a minute. This was more than just a company. It was an empire that didn't like outsiders. What Andrea didn't know was that as she was trying to find her place there, someone was already viewing her as a problem. And that person would do everything in their power to remove her from the building. In the following days, she began to see a different side of Fernando. The cold, calculating man she had first met in the cafe wasn't exactly the same as the one she was seeing now. In the company corridors, she witnessed moments where he stepped away from important meetings just to respond to a message from Mateo. She saw him walking through the design floor, asking younger employees about ideas, not just relying on the voices of the directors. And sometimes, she saw him alone in his office, massaging his temples as if carrying more weight than he was willing to admit. Fernando Rios wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man who lived surrounded by distrust and expectations. Andrea wasn't sure what to think of him yet. But she knew that somehow her life would never be the same after accepting that job. What she didn't expect was that even before she could adapt, something would happen that would put everything at risk. The Rios Tower never slept. Even in the early hours of the morning, the higher floors remained lit, computers blinking silently as security guards patrolled the halls on precise shifts. But that night, something different happened. Around 3 in the morning, an internal alert was triggered on the company's servers. Confidential data had been accessed without authorization and minutes later leaked to the press. Headlines began to appear in the early hours of the day, and by dawn, Fernando Rios's name was plastered across every major news outlet. The security team was alerted immediately. Within hours, the technicians traced the origin of the unauthorized access. When the report was handed to the security director, the name that appeared on the record caused him to hesitate before passing the information along to Fernando. Andrea Castillo. The atmosphere in the Rios Tower was charged when Fernando arrived that morning. People whispered in the hallways. The directors were already discussing strategies to contain the crisis, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. But nothing affected Fernando more than the name on the report in his hands. He wanted to believe it was a mistake. He needed to believe it. But doubt had already crept into his mind, persistent and cruel. Since the first moment he had met Andrea, she had seemed different from everyone he was used to dealing with. She wasn't impressed by money, she didn't try to flatter him, she didn't seem to have any ulterior motives. But what if he was wrong? What if in the end, she was just like the rest? He took a deep breath, controlling the emotions threatening to show. He wouldn't make any hasty judgments. He needed to hear from Andrea herself. As soon as he saw her walking down the corridor, he called her without hesitation, his voice sharp and commanding. "My office, now!" Andrea stopped in the middle of her path, surprised by the cold tone. She had never heard him speak like that. The employees around them exchanged discreet glances, but no one dared to comment. She nodded, not understanding the sudden summons, and followed him without question. Once she entered the office, the door was shut behind her with a sharp click. Fernando stood behind his desk, his fists resting on the glass top, looking directly at her. "What's going on?" Andrea asked, glancing quickly at Fernando's computer screen, where a news website still displayed the headline about the data leak. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he spun a tablet on the desk, showing the system access records. Her name was there. Andrea felt the blood drain from her face. Confidential documents spread across the desk displayed graphs, contracts, and internal information that she had never seen before. Her heart raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. The evidence was detailed, too detailed. Confidential emails sent from her login, system accesses registered under her name, internal documents leaked to the competition. Everything pointed to her. Andrea felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It didn't make sense. Someone had framed her. But who? And more importantly, why did Fernando not even consider that possibility? The silence was broken by his low and firm voice. "Do you really think I would do this?" His tone trembled at the end, and Andrea hated that. She hated feeling like she had to defend herself from something so absurd, hated realizing that he hadn't even hesitated. Fernando remained impassive, his face serious, his eyes fixed on her as if evaluating her. Finally, he crossed his arms and said without emotion, "The records show it was accessed from your account." Direct words, a cold verdict. Andrea blinked a few times, trying to process what she was hearing. There was no anger in his voice, no disappointment, no trace of doubt, just facts, just data that on paper condemned her. She took a deep breath, gripping the papers tightly. After everything, she began but stopped, the pain in her throat almost preventing her from continuing. You didn't even consider that this could be a mistake? Fernando didn't respond right away. He just watched her, analyzing her expression, her movements, perhaps searching for something that would confirm what the reports had already said. That's when Andrea understood. It didn't matter what she said. It didn't matter how much she explained. He had already made his decision. A pang of bitterness ran through her chest. She could argue. She could ask him to look beyond the numbers, to see the truth. But if he truly believed in her, if he trusted her at all, this conversation wouldn't even be happening. Andrea's eyes burned, but she refused to let any tears escape. Slowly, she placed the papers on the desk. Her fingers still trembled slightly, but her posture was now rigid. I understand. This time, her voice was firm. She stood up. Fernando didn't stop her. He didn't call her name. He didn't ask for an explanation. Andrea looked at him one last time, searching for some sign of hesitation. But all she found was the same neutral, professional expression, as if he were dismissing any ordinary employee, not a woman who, in some way, had become part of his life. Swallowing hard, she turned her back on him and walked toward the door. Each step seemed to echo in the silence of the room. When she left, she felt the weight of the employees' gazes on her. They had already heard the rumors. They whispered. They watched. Some with surprise, others simply waiting for the confirmation of what they had already suspected. Andrea held her head high as she walked down the corridor of the Rios Tower. She wouldn't let them see her break. But inside, she knew, despite everything they had lived through in recent times, Fernando didn't trust her. And maybe he never had. The indignation burned inside Andrea, a fire that refused to die down. She walked through the streets without really seeing, feeling the heavy steps, her breath out of sync. She could still hear Fernando's cold words echoing in her mind, the way he hadn't hesitated to doubt her. But it didn't matter anymore. Not now. She knew she wasn't guilty. And if Fernando Rios didn't trust her, then she would have to find the truth herself. As she tried to organize her thoughts, a forgotten detail surfaced in her memory. A man. She remembered being at the cafe during one of her shifts. That particular customer hadn't been there just for a coffee. She recalled his eyes, a little too attentive, the subtle questions he had asked, as if he were trying to gather information without appearing invasive. He had asked about the company, about the employees, about the systems. At the time, Andrea hadn't thought much of it. But now, it all made sense. She stopped abruptly in the middle of the sidewalk, ignoring the passers-by who avoided her with impatient glances. She pulled out her phone and with swift fingers started searching the internet. She needed a name, a clue, something. It was faster than she expected. A cross-reference between third-party consultants who had worked with Rios Group in the last few months brought up a name that made her stomach turn. Ramon Morales. The name meant nothing to her until she saw the company he was linked to, a rival group known for its aggressive and unethical strategies in the market. Adrenaline surged through her body. This wasn't a coincidence. She had a suspect. Without thinking twice, she found the address for Ramon Morales' office and hopped into the first taxi she found. The driver looked at her through the rearview mirror, noticing the tense expression on her face. "Where to?" he asked. Andrea took a deep breath before replying. "Towards the truth." The building was sophisticated, modern, but Andrea didn't have time to admire the details. She walked in with determined steps, ignoring the receptionist who tried to stop her. "Miss, do you have an appointment?" the woman asked, standing up from her chair. "He won't want to ignore me," Andrea replied, resolute. Before the receptionist could stop her, Andrea crossed the lobby and found the door to Ramon Morales' office. Without hesitation, She opened it forcefully. The man looked up from his computer, clearly surprised. He was well dressed, his graying hair neatly combed, a smile exuding self-confidence, a smile that widened even more when he saw her. "Miss Castillo," he said, leaning comfortably in his chair. "What a pleasant surprise." Andrea closed the door behind her, keeping her eyes fixed on him. "I know what you did." Ramon laughed, a low, mocking sound. He stood up, walking toward the front of his desk, as if he were playing a game he knew he would win. "That's very vague, my dear," he said, crossing his arms. "What exactly did I do?" "You framed me," she shot back, her anger spilling out. "You used my access to leak information from Rios Group." Ramon tilted his head, entertained. "Ah, so the little girl is playing detective, huh?" Andrea felt her hands tremble, but not from fear, from rage. "You don't have proof," he continued with a shrug. "And even if you did, do you really think anyone would listen to you? The all-powerful Fernando Rios has already decided you're guilty, right?" She remained silent for a moment. Then, slowly, she took her phone out of her pocket and held it up. On the screen, the recording was already playing. Ramon furrowed his brow. "What is this?" Andrea smiled, but without humor. "The proof that for the first time someone is going to hear what I have to say." Ramon's face drained of color. For the first time in the conversation, he didn't seem as confident. Ramon Morales was pale. The air of superiority he had worn since Andrea barged into his office had disappeared. He stared at the phone she was holding, where his confession was clearly recorded. He tried to compose himself, adjusting his tie, a weak smile forming on his lips. "You think this means anything?" he said, trying to regain some confidence. "There's no context. It can be interpreted in several ways." Andrea raised an eyebrow, holding the phone tightly. "Oh, so let's test it," she replied, swiping her finger across the screen. "I can send it to Rios Group, to the news outlets, to social media. I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in hearing what you have to say." Ramon stiffened. "You don't know who you're dealing with?" Andrea laughed, but without humor. "No, Ramon, you're the one who doesn't know who you're dealing with." The man opened his mouth to retort, but Andrea didn't give him the chance. Her fingers were already dialing a number she never thought she would call again. The line rang only twice before it was answered. "Andrea?" Fernando's voice came from the other end, carrying something she couldn't identify immediately. She took a deep breath, keeping her eyes fixed on Ramon. "I can prove I wasn't the one." A heavy silence filled the line. Andrea could almost feel Fernando holding his breath on the other side. "Where are you?" he asked finally, his voice more contained than she had expected. "At Ramon Morales' office," she answered, "and I have everything recorded." Another moment of silence passed, and then Fernando said simply, "Don't leave, I'm on my way." Andrea lowered the phone slowly, feeling her heart beat faster. Ramon watched her, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He knew his time was up. Andrea proved her innocence that night. The recording was enough to prompt Fernando to order a full investigation. Within 24 hours, the system logs confirmed that Andrea's identity had been used to leak information. But the access came from an external device linked to Ramon Morales. Rios Group severed ties with him immediately, hiring lawyers to handle the case. Fernando, for his part, did something he hated. He admitted he was wrong. In the days that followed, Andrea received calls, messages, and even unexpected visits at her apartment. She didn't answer any of them. There was something about the way Fernando had judged her, the way he had discarded her word without hesitation, that made it impossible to forget. He was the man who had taken her out of the cafe, who had given her an opportunity she never asked for, and at the moment doubt arose, he treated her like any other disposable person in his life. Andrea didn't need anyone who doubted her so easily. Fernando, on the other hand, realized too late that he had made a mistake that couldn't be fixed with simple apologies. Then came the second consequence of his choices. Mateo. Fernando's son had always been a quiet boy, but now something was different about him, something broken. The first time Fernando noticed this was when he tried to talk to him about Andrea. Mateo, he began, carefully choosing his words. The boy, sitting on the couch with an open book in his lap, didn't look up. "What's wrong?" Mateo asked without raising his head. Fernando frowned. "You've been acting strange lately." Mateo shrugged, his eyes fixed on the page, but Fernando knew he wasn't reading. "I'm not strange," the boy said simply. Fernando sat down in the armchair in front of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. "Does this have to do with Andrea?" It was then that Mateo looked at him, and in his son's gaze, Fernando saw something that troubled him deeply. "You hurt her," Mateo said bluntly. Fernando inhaled deeply. "I made a mistake," he admitted. Mateo slowly closed the book. "You doubted her," he said calmly. Fernando turned his gaze away for a brief moment, feeling a tightness in his chest. "I know." Mateo studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "I liked her." Fernando looked at his son, realizing the depth of those words. Mateo wasn't a child who easily formed attachments. He was used to being treated as someone different, someone who needed to be protected, cared for, but never included. Andrea, however, had never treated him that way. She saw him, really. And Fernando had pushed away the only real connection Mateo had outside the closed circle they lived in. Mateo slid off the couch and started walking out of the room. But before leaving, he turned and said, "You should fix this." Fernando remained seated, motionless. His son wasn't the type to give advice, and if even he could see the magnitude of the mistake Fernando had made, then maybe it was time to do something about it. But the question was, would Andrea listen to him? Fernando Rios was not a man who allowed himself to doubt his decisions. From a young age, he had learned that the world belonged to those who took the lead, to those who didn't hesitate. In the environment he had grown up in and the market where he built his empire, hesitation was synonymous with weakness. He doubted because it was necessary, because that's how he avoided being deceived, betrayed, destroyed. Because in his position, trusting people was a luxury he couldn't afford. And for the first time, he began to question all of that. Sitting in his office, with the city lights stretching beyond the glass windows, he rested his elbows on the desk, his gaze lost in the papers scattered in front of him. Throughout his life, he had treated every relationship like a contract. People had interests, and he knew how to anticipate them. But Andrea, she never asked for anything. And still, when the first doubt appeared, he had been unable to trust her. The recording of Ramon Morales still echoed in his mind. The irrefutable proof that he had been wrong, that he had acted hastily, that he had made a mistake that perhaps he couldn't fix. The phone beside him remained silent. He had tried calling, sent messages, even gone to Andrea's apartment. But she hadn't wanted to see him, and deep down he understood why. "Damn it," he murmured, rubbing his hands over his face. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the mistake he had made or the fact that he didn't know how to fix it. "You're thinking about her again." Mateo's voice broke the silence in the room. Fernando lifted his gaze and saw his son standing in the doorway, watching him with a calm, observant expression. Mateo wasn't the type to speak much, but when he did, Fernando knew that his words carried more weight than they appeared. "Yes," Fernando admitted. The boy stepped into the room slowly and sat down in the armchair opposite the desk. He stayed silent for a moment, just looking at his hands. Fernando realized that Mateo was choosing his words carefully. "Do you want to know what I liked most about her?" Mateo asked finally. Fernando furrowed his brow. intrigued. "What?" Matteo raised his eyes to meet his father's, his gaze sincere, unfiltered. "She never looked at me like I was a burden." Fernando felt a tightness in his chest. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "A burden?" he repeated, his voice softer than he intended. Matteo nodded slowly. "People always try to be nice to me, but I can see it in their eyes. They see me as a problem, a weight, a responsibility." Fernando pressed his lips together, feeling something bitter spread inside of him. He had always made sure Matteo had the best of everything: clinics, prestigious schools, doctors, caretakers, but he had never really asked how his son felt in the midst of it all. "Andrea never did that," Matteo continued. "She saw me like a person, like a normal kid." Fernando closed his eyes for a moment. The weight of his choices settled on him in a way he had never felt before. Not just about Andrea, but about his son as well. How had he missed it before? When he opened his eyes again, his expression was different. He knew what he had to do. Fernando grabbed the phone, his gaze fixed on the screen. The recording of Andrea was still paused at the moment when Ramon Morales had confessed to using her credentials to leak information. He exhaled deeply and hit play. Ramon's voice echoed through the room, the arrogant tone, confident as someone who thought they were untouchable. Fernando listened to every word, every false accusation, every mocking laugh. He felt the weight of his mistake become unbearable. He stopped the recording and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he rarely experienced: regret. Fernando Rios was used to making definitive decisions, to acting with cold precision and strategy, to putting business above everything else. But for the first time in years, he felt paralyzed. He had tried to continue his routine as if nothing had happened. He dove into work, buried himself in meetings, analyzed reports, and participated in multi-million-dollar negotiations. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that everything was under control, the truth was, his mind couldn't stop thinking about Andrea. She haunted him in every small detail. The coffee he drank every morning, the silence in his meeting room, the hallways in the company. Every space seemed filled with her absence, and the worst part was knowing that the blame was entirely his. She hadn't just proven her innocence, she had proven that he had never trusted her. The calls he made went unanswered. The messages remained unread. Even when he went to her apartment, he had to face the reality that Andrea didn't want to see him. Fernando wasn't the type of man to insist when someone made it clear they didn't want his presence. But this time, it wasn't about insistence. It was about fixing a mistake he shouldn't have made. That's when he decided. He grabbed the keys to his car and left the Rios Group building without informing anyone. He drove through the streets of Monterrey with his thoughts racing. When he realized it, he was parked in front of the same modest cafe where it had all started. The luxurious car stood out starkly in the otherwise humble neighborhood. Some customers were coming and going, unaware of the significance of the man who had just arrived. Inside, Andrea was sitting alone at a table sipping coffee. Her posture was tired, weighed down by the burdens she carried, but she still tried to maintain her dignity. Fernando hesitated for a moment. What would he say? How would he begin? He took a deep breath and walked over to her. "Andrea?" She blinked slowly, without any surprise. She raised her eyes to meet his, and before he could say anything more, she said calmly, "I just wanted you to know the truth." Fernando felt a lump in his throat. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just the simple acknowledgement of a fact. He pulled the chair in front of her and sat down. "I doubted you, and that was my biggest mistake," he confessed, his voice softer than he intended. Andrea held his gaze for a few seconds. Then, without saying a word, she pushed her coffee cup toward him. Then start by paying for this. Fernando raised an eyebrow, a small, incredulous laugh escaping him. Fair enough. He waved at the waitress and paid for the coffee. The silence between them remained for a few moments, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence full of meaning, full of words that still needed to be spoken. Fernando leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and took a deep breath before speaking. When I listened to the recording of Ramon, it was like something inside me collapsed. Andrea stayed quiet, listening. I've always lived expecting people to betray me, he continued, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid in his cup. Maybe because I grew up in a world where trust always had a price. She narrowed her eyes slightly. And you put me in that same place. Fernando lifted his gaze to hers. Yes, he admitted without hesitation. Andrea sighed, leaning back in her chair. I'm not that kind of person, Fernando. I never was. He nodded slowly. I know that now. But at the time, you believed what was more convenient, she completed, because it was easier than believing in me. Fernando didn't deny it, he couldn't. She took a deep breath before asking, What do you want, Fernando? The question came directly, without pretense. He ran a hand through his hair, choosing his words carefully. I want you to come back. Andrea frowned. To the company. He hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. To my life. To Matteo's life. She lowered her eyes to her cup, spinning it gently between her fingers. You want me to pretend nothing happened? No, he responded quickly. I want us to have a chance to start over. Andrea let out a small, humorless laugh. You're not the type of man to give second chances. Fernando met her gaze, his expression softening. For some people I am. She studied him for a long time. And Matteo? His son's name made Fernando's chest tighten. He misses you. Andrea sighed, biting her lower lip, as if weighing her response. Finally, a small smile appeared on her lips. Well, I guess I have a good reason to come back. Fernando felt a relief he hadn't known he needed, and in that moment he knew that some things truly could be fixed.